On a cold October night in the year 1307, the port of La Rochelle lay under a shroud of silence. The sea breathed in long, heavy waves, and the damp wind carried the taste of salt across the wooden piers. The moon, half veiled by clouds, cast only a faint glow, so dim that the tall masts waiting in the harbor looked like darkened spires rising into the night sky. Normally, this harbor would echo with the shouts of sailors, the groan of ropes, the slap of waves against hulls. But tonight, there was only quiet. Quiet so thick that every creak of timber seemed louder than thunder. Out on the water, shadows stirred. Ships 12, perhaps as many as 18, began to move, slipping from their moorings, as though guided by an unseen hand. They belonged to the Knights Templar, the most feared and most mysterious order of the Middle Ages, and they were leaving without ceremony, without witnesses, without a trace. Their sails remained furled, their torches dimmed. The crews worked in silence, not a voice raised, not a word spoken. And slowly, one by one, the vessels glided out into the black waters of the Atlantic, vanishing beyond the mist. Why would they leave on this night of all nights? Because dawn would bring disaster. The morning of October 13th, 1307, was set to mark the downfall of the entire order. King Philip IV of France, desperate for wealth to fill his treasury and pay his armies, had coordinated with Pope Clement V in Rome. Together they issued secret orders for the arrest of every Templar in France, accusing them of heresy, corruption, and blasphemy. Soldiers would fan out at sunrise, seizing commanderies, castles, and treasuries. Yet when the king's men stormed the Paris temple, expecting mountains of gold, they found only empty halls. The treasure Philip craved was gone. It had been moved, and the last place it was seen was La Rochelle. La Rochelle was no ordinary port. In the early 14th century, it was a hub of trade, a gateway to the Atlantic, and more importantly, a stronghold of the Templars. They had warehouses here, docks of their own, and a fleet at the ready. If the order needed to move wealth quickly and secretly, this was the place. We can picture the final days before the purge. Carts rolling in under cover of darkness, crates lowered into the holds of waiting ships, guarded not by soldiers of the crown, but by the white-mantled knights of the temple themselves. Gold, silver, relics from the Holy Land, scrolls written in forgotten tongues, whatever it was they carried. It was deemed too precious to risk falling into the hands of Philip or the Pope. What is most unsettling is how little record exists of this departure. There are no customs logs, no royal decrees mentioning the movement of ships that night. It is as though the fleet dissolved into thin air. But scattered in Europe's archives are whispers letters from clerks, bishops, and officials who noticed missing inventories, unaccounted vessels, cargo lists that ended abruptly. None of them received attention at the time. Historians centuries later would dismiss them as clerical errors, rumors exaggerated to explain unpaid debts. Yet the consistency of these fragments across France, Spain, and England cannot be ignored. Too many voices noted ships that sailed and never returned. Too many documents refer to losses that were never explained. Silence itself became evidence, and that silence raises a troubling possibility. Perhaps the Templars knew long before October that their destruction was coming. Perhaps they had prepared meticulously, making sure that when the hammer fell, their wealth and their secrets would already be beyond the reach of king and pope alike. If so, that night at La Rochelle was not the frantic flight of desperate men, but the execution of a carefully designed escape. A plan that transformed the order from a visible power into a hidden one. Imagine standing there on the pier, a townsman of La Rochelle who who happened to see. The night is damp and heavy. A procession of white-cloaked figures moves with urgency, carrying chests down gangplanks, whispering to one another in low voices. The sea is calm but tense, as though it too senses the gravity of the moment. You hear the ropes tightening, the sails unfurling just enough to catch the wind. Lanterns flicker once, then are hooded to darkness. The fleet begins to move, sliding into the mist without so much as a farewell. If you were that witness, would you tell anyone? Or would you, like so many others, keep silent, understanding that what you saw was not meant to be spoken of? From that silence grew one of history's greatest enigmas. Where did the ships go? Were they bound for Scotland to aid Robert the Bruce against the English? Did they find refuge in Portugal, where the Order of Christ would soon rise in the Templars' place? Did they vanish westward, across the uncharted Atlantic, to islands and continents yet to be named? The chronicles offer no certainty, only tantalizing clues. But what is undeniable is that a fleet of ships left La Rochelle on that fateful night. They did not vanish into myth. They departed with purpose. And so we stand at the threshold of a mystery that has haunted 7 centuries. The dark night at La Rochelle was not an ending, but a beginning. The beginning of a hidden journey, a scattered legacy, a silence that still refuses to break. To follow it, we must look beyond the grasp of kings and popes, beyond the official histories, into the shadows where the Templars learned to survive. For history may say the order was destroyed, but the sea remembers otherwise. And somewhere, beyond that midnight horizon, the lost fleet carried with it treasures, relics, and truths too dangerous to leave behind. Dawn broke on October 13th, 1307, not with the ordinary rhythm of a kingdom waking, but with the calculated violence of a trap snapping shut. Across France, as bells tolled for morning prayer, soldiers fanned out with sealed orders from King Philip IV. They carried with them accusations whispered into existence by the crown: heresy, blasphemy, sorcery, even obscene rituals. To the public, it was a purge of corruption. To those who understood, it was a robbery disguised as righteousness. Philip, known as the Fair, wore a mask of piety, but beneath it lurked desperation. Wars with England had drained his coffers, his need for coin pressing like a vice upon his throne. The Templars ridged beyond measure, with estates spread from Paris to Jerusalem offered the perfect solution. Their order, once crusaders in the Holy Land, had become bankers to kings. They held deposits, granted loans, managed treasuries. Philip himself was heavily indebted to them, and what easier way to erase a debt than to erase the creditor? Yet Philip could not act alone. To strike the Templars was to strike the very church, for the order was sanctioned by the Pope and bound by sacred vows. So Philip turned his gaze to Rome, where Clement V sat upon the papal throne, uncertain and pliable. Clement owed his position to Philip's pressure. He was a pope in Avignon, not Rome, a pontiff tethered by strings pulled from Paris. And though Clement hesitated at condemning the Templars, the will of the French crown bent him steadily toward compliance. So the machinery of accusation was set in motion. Rumors were seeded. The knights spat on the cross, worshipped idols, practiced secret rituals by firelight. These charges, unproven and fantastical, spread like smoke, darkening the image of the once holy warriors. By the time the soldiers moved, public suspicion had already been kindled. That morning, thousands of knights awoke as respected guardians of Christendom and went to bed as prisoners branded with shame. In Paris, the arrests were swift and merciless. Jacques de Maule, the Grand Master of the Order, was seized along with his senior officers. They were shackled, questioned, and tortured until words were forced from their mouths, confessions that later they would recant, but which served Philip's purpose all the same. To the people, it appeared that the once proud Templars had admitted to crimes unspeakable. To the crown, it meant justification. To the Pope, it meant silence. And yet, behind the spectacle, a deeper silence unsettled Philip. The treasure he sought was not found. The vaults of Paris stood empty, the chests of coin, the reliquaries, the scrolls all gone. The arrests had captured men, but not the wealth, prisoners, but not the power. Somewhere, perhaps even as the king's guards paraded the chained knights through the streets, ships were already slipping westward, carrying away everything he hoped to seize. Picture the corridors of the Louvre, where Philip paced with clenched fists. His ministers laid parchment before him, lists of estates seized, lands confiscated, castles now in royal hands. But the gold, the lifeblood of kings, was missing. "Where is it?" he demanded. "Where have they hidden it?" No one could answer. No official could trace it. No scribe could produce a record. Meanwhile, in Avignon, Pope Clement V faced his own turmoil. Letters from Philip pressed upon him like stones upon his chest. Approve the arrests, condemn the Templars, dissolve the order. The Pope hesitated, for deep within the Vatican's knowledge lay truths that contradicted Philip's accusations. Clement knew, as later discovered in the hidden Chinim parchment, that the knights had been absolved of heresy in secret hearings. Yet to resist the king would be to invite schism, perhaps even war. And so Clement did what so many men of power have done when faced with a truth too dangerous. He chose silence. In the years that followed, that silence would deepen into complicity. The Templars who survived imprisonment were forced into confessions and executions. D'Aumale himself, after years in chains, was burned at the stake in 1314. Legend says that as the flames rose around him, he called down a curse upon both king and pope, summoning them to meet him before God within a year. And whether by chance or fate, both Philip and Clement were dead before another winter passed. But curses and confessions could not erase the greater mystery, what had truly happened to the wealth of the Templars. If Philip had struck the body, why did the spirits still seem to breathe in whispers of vanished fleets, hidden vaults, and letters that spoke of ships never returned? The attack had crushed the visible order. Yes, castles fell, knights perished, banners were torn down, but in the shadows, something endured. It is here that the enigma deepens, for the destruction of the Templars was not complete. The purge was brutal, but it was not absolute. Too many records hint at preparation. Too many signs point to escape. The very coordination of Philip's strike, meant to ensure no one could slip away, only underscores the fact that some did. And not just men, but the very heart of what the Templars sought to protect. As we step deeper into this story, the question becomes not whether the Templars were guilty or innocent, but what they carried away in their silence. The Vatican may have bowed to Philip, but the archives whisper another tale. The king may have believed he destroyed the order, but the sea tells us otherwise. The strike of October 1307 was meant to be an ending. Instead, it was a fracture, a tearing of threads that would weave themselves into new patterns across Europe and perhaps far beyond. To understand the fleet's departure from La Rochelle, we must understand this strike not merely as a political maneuver, but as the spark that scattered the Templar legacy into shadows we still chase today. And so, as Philip's soldiers dragged knights into prisons and the Pope sealed his lips in silence, the greater mystery had already slipped beyond their grasp. The true treasure, the true secret, had sailed out of reach. When the smoke of the arrests cleared and the trials dragged on, one fact lingered like an echo in an empty hall. The treasure of the Templars was gone. It was not in Paris, where Philip's men scoured vaults and storerooms. It was not in the castles, where inquisitors catalogued everything from grain to livestock. Wherever the wealth of 2 centuries had been stored, it had slipped away, vanishing as surely as the fleet that left La Rochelle. The question has haunted historians and dreamers alike. What exactly did the knights take with them? To imagine the answer, we must first consider what the order possessed. They were not merely warriors, but also bankers, landlords, and pilgrims of power. Their coffers brimmed with coin collected from Europe's nobility, deposits entrusted by kings, and rents from thousands of estates. Gold and silver, enough to pay armies for years, could have filled the holds of their ships. Yet, if it was only money, would the mystery have endured so long? After all, gold has a way of reappearing. Melted down, stamped anew, spent into circulation. Wealth leaves traces, but the Templar treasure left none. That absence has given rise to more dangerous possibilities. Perhaps what was carried away was not metal, but meaning. The knights had walked the streets of Jerusalem, entered ruins that even in their day were ancient, and camped upon ground sacred to 3 faiths. Rumors swirled that they had unearthed relics, fragments of the true cross, the Holy Grail itself, or even the Ark of the Covenant. To medieval minds, such relics were not mere curiosities, but objects of immense spiritual and political power. Whoever held them could command not only wealth, but belief. And belief, as every monarch knew, was the truest coin of all. Legends cling especially to the Grail. Some say the Templars discovered it beneath the Temple Mount, hidden away since the days of the Apostles. Others claim they carried secret gospels, texts that would shake the very foundations of church authority if ever revealed. Imagine the threat such knowledge would pose to Philip and Clement. Truths that could expose the papacy or unmask the illusions of kingship. If this was the treasure, then the fleet's departure was not simply flight, but guardianship. A vow to keep dangerous truths from falling into hostile hands. Yet there is another possibility, quieter and in many ways more compelling. The Templars were record keepers. They maintained archives of contracts, maps of routes, and perhaps most importantly, knowledge gathered in the East. In an age when most men never left their village, the knights moved across continents. They may have preserved charts of unknown coasts, trade routes long forgotten, or even fragments of scientific wisdom inherited from older civilizations. Knowledge of the stars, of navigation, of building and finance secrets that would one day fuel the Renaissance and the age of discovery. Could it be that the treasure was not something tangible, but the intellectual fire that would ignite centuries later? Picture the holds of those departing ships. Chests are loaded one by one, but they do not ring with the sound of gold. Instead, they are heavy with scrolls, bound codices, carved relics swaddled in cloth. Knights lift them with reverence, not greed. The sea air fills with the scent of wax and ink, not coin. These are not spoils, but seeds. Seeds carried into exile, meant to be planted in hidden soil until the time was right. Of course, skeptics argue otherwise. They remind us that no vault has ever been found, no undeniable relic produced. They point to Oak Island, where shafts have swallowed fortune hunters for centuries, yielding only fragments, coconut fibers, carved stones, strange timbers. Yet even these scraps whisper of something unnatural, a complexity beyond the reach of farmers or fishermen. Why go to such lengths if not to hide something that mattered? The very effort speaks of importance. and the silence of history only deepens the intrigue. The absence of evidence, in this case, becomes its own evidence. For centuries, kings hoarded gold, and sooner or later their coins surfaced again in markets or treasuries. But nothing of the Templar hoard has resurfaced, not in Spain, not in France, not in England, unless, of course, we have been looking in the wrong place. Perhaps the treasure was never meant to reappear as it was. Perhaps it was transformed into the banking systems that would dominate Europe, into the symbols carved on cathedral walls, into the knowledge that guided ships across oceans. A treasure not spent, but sown. What makes this question so haunting is its refusal to resolve. The Grail remains elusive, the Ark remains hidden, the scrolls remain unverified, but the absence itself creates a gravity, pulling theories into its orbit. Each idea gold relics, knowledge speaks less about what the Templars carried than about what humanity most desires: wealth, faith, truth. Each generation projects its hunger onto the mystery. And in that way, the treasure continues to live, not in vaults or chests, but in the imaginations of those who seek it. So when we speak of the vanished treasure, we may be speaking of more than objects. We may be speaking of the Order's greatest achievement: to transform loss into legend, to turn silence into a story so powerful it survives 7 centuries. For whether it was coin or chalice, ark or archive, the fact remains: something slipped away into the night at La Rochelle. Something that kings and popes could not seize, something that still refuses to surface. And perhaps that is the final key. Perhaps the treasure was never meant to be found at all, but to serve as a reminder, a question lodged in the human mind. What did the Templars protect? What did they fear to lose? And most of all, what might still lie hidden, waiting for a world prepared to face it? As we follow the trail, we leave behind the empty vaults of Paris and turn toward the soil of mystery itself. For on a distant island in the North Atlantic, the earth hides tunnels and traps, coconut fibers and carved stones, whispers of engineering that should not have been possible. There, perhaps, the shadow of the vanished treasure still lingers, and it is to Oak Island that our journey now leads. Far across the Atlantic, on the windswept coast of Nova Scotia, there lies a small, unassuming island. To the casual eye, it is nothing remarkable: trees, rocks, and a shoreline battered by the restless tides. Yet for more than 2 centuries, Oak Island has been the stage for one of history's most enduring enigmas. Here, the earth itself seems to guard a secret, whispering of hidden chambers, impossible tunnels, and, perhaps, the lost treasure of the Templars. The story begins in 1795, when a teenager named Daniel McGuinness rowed across the water and set foot upon the island. What he found was curious: a depression in the soil, circular and distinct, as though something had once been buried there. Nearby, the remnants of a pulley hung from an ancient oak tree, a silent clue that someone, long before him, had labored here. Intrigued, Daniel returned with friends, and together they began to dig. What they uncovered was no ordinary pit. Every 10 feet, they struck a layer of timber, carefully placed, as if someone had deliberately built platforms down into the earth. At 90 feet, they discovered a flat stone bearing mysterious carvings, symbols that no one has ever conclusively translated. And then, without warning, the pit flooded with seawater, rising so quickly that the men were forced to abandon their work. The hole they had opened became a trap, swallowing their tools and hopes in an instant. This was the birth of the Money Pit, a name that would prove grimly prophetic. For over 2 centuries, companies, adventurers, and fortune seekers have poured wealth into its depths, Millions of dollars, countless hours, even human lives. Each time the earth yielded only fragments, coconut fibers, far from any natural source, parchment with faded ink, layers of oak and spruce precisely engineered. None of it proved treasure, yet all of it testified to something deliberate, something intelligent, something hidden. And here lies the whisper. For what purpose would anyone construct such a labyrinth, with flood tunnels designed to drown intruders, layers of wood placed like markers, stones inscribed with codes? Who would go to such effort if not to conceal something of immense value? Skeptics argue it is a natural sinkhole, an accident of geology. But how, then, explain the fibers imported from tropics thousands of miles away? How explain the cross carved into the island's stones, aligned with striking precision to points of the compass? These are not the fingerprints of chance. One theory has haunted Oak Island more than any other, that this was the final vault of the Templars' missing fleet. Imagine the ships leaving La Rochelle, heavy with cargo, navigating across the uncharted Atlantic. They land not in some bustling port, but on a lonely island, chosen precisely for its remoteness. There, with knowledge gained from centuries of engineering fortresses, they dig deep, constructing chambers and booby traps to safeguard what they carried. The pit becomes their cathedral in the earth, a monument of secrecy. When they depart, the island is left behind, its secret sealed beneath stone and tide. Generations later, when settlers arrive, they see only the trees and the silence. The vault waits, untouched, but legends have long shadows, and whispers drifted across the centuries until McGuinness and his friends stumbled upon that depression in the soil. From then onward, the island consumed dreamers like the pit consumed their tools, each expedition falling victim to the same cunning defenses. Machinery jammed, shafts flooded, tunnels collapsed. Men dug with hope but emerged with nothing but mud and loss. Yet fragments continued to surface. In the 19th century, reports emerged of inscriptions on the 90-foot stone. One claimed translation read, 40 feet below, 2 million pounds are buried. Others insist the markings were not letters at all, but codes resembling early cipher scripts. Still later, coconut fibers were carbon dated to the 14th century, the very century of the Templars' fall. Such threads may not weave a full tapestry, but they form a pattern hard to ignore. Picture the island today. Winds howl through the trees. The pit lies quiet, its mouth ringed by rusted machinery, reminders of past failures. The ground feels heavy, as if holding its breath. Tourists walk the trails, but beneath their feet. Chambers may still extend outward, networks of tunnels deliberately flooded to keep seekers at bay. It is a place where silence becomes palpable, where every stone seems to watch, where the earth itself whispers, not yet. The Templars were masters of secrecy, of building not just walls, but mysteries. Oak Island bears the marks of that mastery, whether or not gold waits beneath. The design itself tells a story that something was meant to be hidden, something never intended for casual discovery. And perhaps that was always the point, for the true value of Oak Island may not be in what it conceals, but in what it provokes. The pit draws us into history's shadow, forcing us to ask not only what was buried, but why. Was it gold? Was it relics? Or was it knowledge too dangerous to reveal? Some suggest the vault may hold documents, gospels unrecognized, genealogies that would append dynasties, maps that would rewrite the story of discovery. If so, then Oak Island is not a treasury but a time capsule, designed to keep truths safe until the world is ready. And yet, the island resists. Every attempt to pierce its defenses has ended in failure. It is as though the pit itself conspires to protect its secret. And perhaps that, too, is part of the design. For in mystery lies endurance. The longer the pit refuses to yield, the longer its legend grows. And the longer its legend grows, the more the Templars succeed in their oldest vow, to guard. So the whisper beneath the earth continues, in the sigh of the wind through the pines, in the creak of abandoned diggers, in the silence of tunnels drowned long ago, the island breathes its secret. And until the day the earth finally speaks, Oak Island will remain less a place than a question, a living riddle carved into stone and soil. And that question leads us onward, not just to the earth of Nova Scotia, but to the paper trails scattered across Europe. For even as Oak Island tempts us with silence, forgotten letters in dusty archives speak of ships that vanished, ships that perhaps carried their burdens westward. To follow the fleet, we must turn from soil to parchment, from pits to ink, from earthbound silence to faint voices in the dark. In the shadowed corners of Europe's archives, among stacks of parchment that crumble at a touch, lie letters almost too faint to notice. They are not declarations of kings or bowls of popes. They are quieter, humbler things, complaints of clerks, inventories of property, reports written in the dim light of monasteries. And yet within these faint voices is a thread that, if followed, may lead us straight to the vanished fleet of the Templars. One letter comes from a French royal clerk in the early 1400s, no more than a weary record of administrative frustration. He writes of inventories incomplete, ships missing, and cargoes that cannot be accounted for. His tone is not dramatic, not conspiratorial. He is simply exasperated. How can he complete his work when vessels that should be seized under the king's order have disappeared? The casual nature of the complaint is what makes it chilling. For in that plain note lies confirmation that ships known to exist in 1307 were no longer in the royal grasp. Their crews gone, their fates unrecorded. Another letter, this time from Spain, speaks of vessels departing in haste just days before the arrests began. It notes that inquiries were made, but no word ever returned. To a modern reader, the language feels almost resigned, an acknowledgement that something slipped away and would not be retrieved. The letter offers no resolution, only absence. But that absence is precisely what makes it valuable. Silence, recorded on parchment, becomes evidence of silence at sea. And then there is England. A letter preserved in its collections tells of rumors that Templar ships were seen in the Channel long after they should have been seized. Dockmasters, when asked, could confirm nothing. The ships left no trace, as though they had sailed into fog and never emerged. But the fact that the rumor existed, that multiple officials even bothered to ask, suggests that whispers of the fleet's survival were already circulating. None of these letters would be enough on their own, but together, across three nations, they weave a pattern. France, Spain, England each speaks of ships unaccounted for, cargoes unlisted, departures unexplained. If they were lies, why repeat them across borders? If they were mistakes, why do they align so closely in time? Dismissed by historians as anomalies, they instead form a mosaic. And mosaics, even when broken, still reveal the shape of the picture. Consider the setting of these letters. Imagine a scribe in a cold chamber, hunched over parchment by candlelight. Ink dries quickly in the drafty air. He scratches down a note about missing inventories, thinking little of it. For him, it is a nuisance, a bureaucratic knot to untangle. He cannot know that 7 centuries later, researchers will pore over his words, hunting for traces of a fleet that supposedly vanished into myth. His frustration becomes our revelation. The mundane becomes monumental, and yet mainstream history has long ignored these fragments. Why? Perhaps because to acknowledge them would unravel the official story. To accept that the fleet was real, that it departed deliberately, that men and treasures slipped away into the night, that would mean admitting the Templars were not annihilated but transformed. It would mean rethinking centuries of certainty. For the historian, silence is easier than contradiction. Better to label the letters as clerical noise than to confront their implications. But silence is also a choice, and sometimes a weapon. If the crown or papacy knew the truth, burying these references in dusty archives would be the simplest way to erase the trail. Later historians, following the path laid before them, repeated the official tale, leaving the stray letters forgotten. And so they sat, hidden in plain sight, waiting for a world more willing to question. Now, in the digital age, those faint voices have begun to speak again. Archives once locked in monasteries are being scanned, their contents uploaded, their ink turned to data. Thousands of pages can be searched in moments, and anomalies that once slipped past human eyes now glow under the scrutiny of algorithms. Where scholars once tired, machines persist. Where letters were once scattered, patterns now emerge. The forgotten is remembered, the silenced is heard. The power of these letters lies not only in what they say, but in what they imply. If ships truly departed La Rochelle, if they vanished across the horizon carrying cargoes unlisted, then the story of the Templars does not end in 1307. It continues on the waves, in the shadows, in the whispers of rumor and record. The order's body may have been broken by Philip's strike, but its spirit may have survived, carried away in the holds of those silent vessels. Picture this: a fleet slipping out at night, lanterns hooded, sails trimmed low. A king waits for treasure that never arrives. A pope receives confessions stained by torture but empty vaults. And in far-off chambers, clerks scribbled notes of frustration, not knowing they are documenting the greatest vanishing act in history. The ships are gone, but the letters remain, faint voices calling across centuries. They did not disappear, they departed. As we follow this thread, the story widens. The letters are only fragments, but they hint at a trail of survival, a trail that may lead us not just across Europe, but across the sea itself. If the fleet scattered, then its legacy may be scattered too, not erased, but dispersed like seeds in the wind. Scotland, Portugal, even the New World Dawn may hold echoes of that midnight departure. But before we follow the ships into legend, we must pause and ask, why were these letters ignored? Why did history choose silence where voices still spoke? The answer may lie not in the documents themselves, but in the institutions that guarded them. And to explore that, we must turn our gaze toward the Vatican, where silence is not absence but power, and where archives hold truths too dangerous to declare. In the great vaults of the Vatican, where the air smells of dust and candle wax, secrets are measured not in words but in omissions. Shelves stretch for miles, filled with parchment, scrolls, and codices, a labyrinth of memory where the Church has stored the chronicles of centuries. Yet among those shelves, something unsettling appears again and again. Absences. Whole sections of maritime correspondence missing. Letters mislabeled. Files quietly reclassified centuries after they were written. It is as if silence itself has been bound into leather and stored away, a silence too deliberate to be accidental. When the Templars fell under the sword of Philip IV, the Vatican stood at the crossroads. Pope Clement V knew the charges of heresy were flimsy, knew that confessions wrung from broken men under torture could not bear the weight of truth. The Chinon parchment, discovered only in 2001, revealed that Clement absolved the Templar leadership in secret, acknowledging their sins as human failings rather than demonic corruption. And yet, despite that absolution, he allowed Philip's purge to proceed. Why? The answer lies in silence, chosen for survival, silence chosen to bury a truth too dangerous to announce. Imagine Clement in Avignon, far from Rome, his papacy tethered to the will of the French crown. To oppose Philip openly would have meant conflict, not just with a king, but with the machinery of state itself. The Church, already weakened by schism and politics, could not afford the risk. So Clement acted as many in power have always acted when confronted with inconvenient truths. He let them disappear. Publicly, he dissolved the order. Privately, he preserved knowledge of their innocence. Between those two acts, a gulf of silence was born, and into that gulf, the fleet of La Rochelle slipped. For centuries afterward, the Vatican archives held their silence intact. Scholars who gained limited access noted oddities. Maritime files from the years surrounding 1307 missing. Correspondence between papal envoys and French officials cut short mid-series. Even catalogues compiled in the 19th century showed signs of alteration, as though someone had combed through, plucking out threads that unraveled too close to the truth. What was removed? Letters confirming the departure of ships, accounts of relics spirited away, or perhaps maps charting routes not meant to be revealed. Skeptics argue that time alone explains the gaps. Fire, mold, negligence, sole common culprits in the long decay of archives, and yet the pattern troubles. Too many absences aligned with the very years of the Templar suppression. Too many reclassifications tied to maritime records, the very kind that might mention ships, cargo, destinations. Absence may be natural, but absence in just the right places, that begins to look like intent. Picture the scene: a Vatican scribe in the 19th century, cataloguing manuscripts by lamplight. He comes upon a folder of letters, notes them, labels them, enters them into the index. Decades later, a researcher returns, only to find the folder gone. The entry reassigned to a vague miscellaneous. The disappearance is quiet, bureaucratic, bloodless, but the effect is the same as if the parchment itself had been burned. Silence has triumphed again. This silence, though, is not empty. It speaks in its own way. The very act of erasure suggests that something was once there, something inconvenient. If the Templars truly were destroyed, if their fleet truly sank into oblivion, why remove the records? Why fear letters that would merely confirm the official tale? No, the only reason to erase is to conceal. And the only reason to conceal is that the truth contradicts the story we have been told. Consider the Vatican's history with secrets. The Church has long guarded knowledge, some sacred, some profane. The Dead Sea Scrolls withheld for decades. The Index of Forbidden Books, designed to silence voices that questioned orthodoxy. In this pattern, the Templars fit perfectly. Better to suppress a handful of inconvenient documents than to reopen wounds, to risk exposing the possibility that the Knights had not vanished but endured. For if they endured, then the authority of Philip's strike, and by extension the Church's compliance, would be forever tainted. And so the Vatican's silence became a tomb, one that holds not bodies but truths. Within it, we sense the ghost of the fleet, hovering in the spaces where records should be. The silence is not proof, but it is a shadow, and shadows tell us where the light has been blocked. In this way, the absence of evidence becomes evidence of absence, deliberately crafted. The truth was not lost. It was hidden. Now, in our own age, as digital archives slowly peel back layers of secrecy, the Vatican remains cautious. Only fragments are released, carefully curated, often decades after they are requested. The Chinon parchment emerged by accident, its absolution a quiet contradiction of centuries of narrative. What else waits, still locked in iron cabinets, too dangerous to see the light? The fleet of La Rochelle may not be buried in soil or drowned in the Atlantic, may lie dormant in the silences of those archives, hidden by ink, bound by secrecy. Imagine walking the halls of the Vatican Library at night. The marble floors echo with each step. The shelves tower rows upon rows of leather spines, gold-lettered, silent. Somewhere in those shelves lies a folder that should not be there, or rather, a folder that should exist but does not. The silence presses in, and you realize the greatest weapon the Church ever wielded was not the sword, not the flame, but the power to say nothing. And so we return to the question, why was this silence maintained for so long? Was it fear that the Templars' knowledge would undermine the Church's authority? Was it fear that relics of unimaginable power might one day be revealed? Or was it simpler an institutional instinct to bury what contradicts the official line? Whatever the answer, the effect is the same. The silence endures, but silence cannot hold forever. As the archives continue to yield to digitization, as algorithms pass indexes once unreadable, the absences themselves begin to glow like negative space in a photograph. The missing becomes as meaningful as the present, and from that negative space, the whisper of the fleet returns, echoing through the Vatican's marble halls, refusing to be extinguished. From La Rochelle to Avignon, from papal chambers to hidden vaults, the story of the Templars has been shaped as much by what was spoken as by what was silenced. And in that silence, the greatest mystery of all remains. What truth was so dangerous that it had to be buried for 700 years? The next chapter of this mystery does not lie only in archives or absences. It lies in the way modern tools algorithms, pattern recognition, the cold eyes of machines begin to sift through the silence itself. And what they uncover may change not only what we know of the Templars, but how we understand the very nature of secrecy. In ages past, the hunt for the Templar fleet meant mud on boots, dust on parchment, and lantern light flickering in forgotten vaults. Researchers dug into earth and archive alike, chasing fragments, chasing silence. But today the chase looks very different. Our shovels are not of iron but of code. Our lanterns are not candles but algorithms. And as the 21st century peers back into the 14th, a strange thing begins to happen. The past starts speaking to machines. Across Europe, thousands of medieval documents, once guarded in monasteries or royal libraries, are being digitized. The brittle pages that human hands feared to touch are now scanned into luminous images, their faded ink rendered in pixels. At first, it seemed like nothing more than preservation, a way to stop time from erasing fragile texts. But when computers were set upon these archives, something unexpected emerged. The machines saw patterns where human eyes had seen only noise. In shipping logs from Bordeaux, for example, algorithms noticed sudden breaks in continuity. Ships are listed as arriving, but no departure is recorded. Cargoes are marked as unknown, debts referenced for vessels that supposedly no longer existed. To a clerk in 1370, these entries may have seemed ordinary, a scribal oversight. To an algorithm comparing thousands of entries across decades, they glow like anomalies, red flags pointing toward disappearance. In England, another irregularity surfaced. The same ship name appears twice on the same date, once in the Channel and once off the coast of Portugal. Human error, perhaps, or was it deliberate confusion, a way to mask movements in the wake of persecution? For centuries, such inconsistencies were dismissed. But when machines lined them side by side, a pattern began to take shape. The outline of ships, moving without record, perhaps even without permission, slipping past the gaze of kings. Even the language itself became a code to be cracked. Letters between clerks and crown officials, long thought routine, revealed subtle fingerprints under natural language processing. Certain phrases in God's protection, for the temple's sake, appeared disproportionately in coastal towns during the very months of the arrests. To a medieval reader, such phrases might have passed as piety, harmless blessings, but algorithms flagged them as markers, repeated with suspicious regularity, as if clerks were leaving quiet notes of something more: the movement of cargo, of men, of secrets. And then there are the Vatican's digital fragments. Though only a fraction of the archives have been released, indexes and catalogues subjected to computational analysis reveal peculiar absences. Entire clusters of maritime correspondence mislabeled, reassigned, or abruptly cut off. The metadata itself tells a story. Files moved in the 19th century, long after their creation, perhaps to bury inconvenient references. To the human scholar, this appears as omission. To the algorithm, it appears as a pattern, an intentional silence shining through the noise. Skeptics protest, warning that AI can conjure meaning from randomness, that gaps are natural after 7 centuries of decay. And yes, caution is wise. But when the same anomalies appear again and again, missing ships, mismatched entries, sudden silences, they form a chorus. Not proof, perhaps, but suggestion. And suggestion is enough to keep the whisper alive. Imagine for a moment that the treasure of the Templars was never meant to be gold or relics, but knowledge itself. What better vault than parchments scattered across kingdoms, too dull to attract attention, yet containing traces of a larger story? And what better guardians than machines, tireless, blind to myth, capable of seeing connections across time? The Templars were masters of secrecy, of hiding in plain sight. But even they could not have foreseen a world where every ledger, every marginal note, every stray word could be cross-examined by engines of pattern. In such a world, their silence itself becomes fragile. Picture a modern researcher sitting not in a monastery but before a glowing screen. Data flows in endless columns, dates and names scrolling faster than any human could read. And then, suddenly, the pattern emerges. A ship listed here, absent there. A cargo erased in one record, mentioned obliquely in another. The researcher leans closer, heart quickening. The machine has caught a whisper across centuries, a trace left not in gold but in ink. Perhaps this is the real treasure of the fleet knot, the hoard of coin Philip IV coveted. But the knowledge that secrecy is never perfect. Time may scatter, men may silence, archives may bury, but fragments endure. And now, in the digital age, the fragments are gathering themselves. Of course, the irony is striking. For centuries, treasure hunters dug Oak Island with shovels, risking lives for a chance at gold that never surfaced. Yet the fleet's truth may not lie beneath mud and stone, but beneath words and numbers. Not in the earth, but in databases. Not in pits, but in patterns. The Templars knew how to vanish into shadows, but in a world of relentless light, shadows themselves begin to tell tales. And so the whisper of the past grows louder, not in cathedrals or castles, but in the quiet hum of servers, in the glow of monitors, in the coded language of algorithms. The fleet, long thought lost, is beginning to re-emerge in it, as a line of ships upon the sea, but as a constellation of clues in the sea of data. Each anomaly a ripple, each silence a signal. Together, they sketch the outline of a departure too deliberate to deny. What happens when these patterns are finally understood? What truths might we face if the machines confirm what legend has long claimed, that the Templars did not die with fire and chain, but survived, scattering their legacy across oceans and centuries? The Vatican's silence may falter, the King's victory may crumble, and history itself may need rewriting. The fleet may never rise again from the Atlantic, but in the age of algorithms, it no longer needs to. It sails quietly through data, its wake visible to those who know how to read. And for the first time in 700 years, the whisper that haunted La Rochelle may be speaking clearly, not through myth or rumor, but through code. And yet, if the fleet scattered, it did not scatter at random. Ships do not sail without a course, nor secrets disperse without design. If they vanished into the night, it was two places, chosen carefully, places where survival, rebirth, or transformation could take root. To follow them, we must leave the silence of archives and the hum of machines, and turn instead to the shores of Scotland, where legend claims that knights in white cloaks rode once more into battle at Bannock. The whisper of the fleet does not end at sea. It echoes inland, carried northward into the misty highlands of Scotland, where another legend waits. It is the year 1314, 7 years after the arrests at La Rochelle, and the fields near a small stream called Bannockburn are about to witness a battle that will shape a nation. On one side stands Robert the Bruce, King of Scots, with an army of farmers, clansmen, and loyal knights. On the other, the vast host of Edward II of England, armoured, disciplined, certain of victory. History remembers Bannockburn as the triumph that secured Scotland's independence. But beneath the chronicles of valour and strategy lies a stranger tale, the story of mysterious warriors who appeared in white, mantles marked with crimson crosses, fighting as if summoned from the shadows of another age. The legend insists that, at the turning point of the battle, when Scottish lines wavered before the crushing weight of English cavalry, a band of knights rode forth. Their armour gleamed, though no banner proclaimed allegiance. They charged with ferocity, scattering mounted foes and driving fear into men who had never seen their like before. Some swore they bore the red cross of the Temple, though the order had been dissolved and outlawed across Europe. Who were these horsemen, if not remnants of the vanished fleet, finding refuge in Scotland, fighting once more as they had in the Holy Land? The story clinks stubbornly to Bannockburn. Chronicles written a century later speak obliquely of knights unknown lending their strength. Oral tradition passed through clans whispers that Bruce himself welcomed exiled Templars, granting them sanctuary in exchange for their swords. And is it coincidence that Bruce, excommunicated by the Pope for the murder of a rival, had little reason to heed Rome's commands? A man cast out by the Church would find natural allies in knights hunted by the same authority. Consider the timing. If ships truly slipped from La Rochelle in 1307, they would need only sail the Channel and the North Sea to reach Scotland's rugged shores. 7 years is more than enough to establish a hidden refuge, to rebuild strength, to await a moment when their presence could alter history. Bannockburn, desperate and decisive, would have been that moment. For the Scots, the arrival of such warriors meant survival. For the Templars, it meant purpose restored. Skeptics dismiss the tale as patriotic myth, a flourish added to glorify Bruce's victory. They note the lack of contemporary records naming the Templars directly. Yet absence, as we have seen, is not always emptiness. The very silence of the chronicles may be deliberate. If exiled knights did fight at Bannockburn, why would chroniclers aligned with Rome dare record it? Better to leave them unnamed than risk censure or scandal. Silence once again becomes a mask. Picture the battlefield itself. Summer sun beats down on trampled grass. The English advance, heavy cavalry bearing down upon the weary Scots. Dust rises, shouts ring, steel clashes. And then from the tree line, from the Meester formation appears. Their charge is sudden, disciplined, utterly fearless. Horses crash into horses, lances pierce armor, the tide shifts. Panic spreads among the English lines. To those who witnessed it, it must have felt like divine intervention, a ghostly host arriving at the hour of need. Were they truly Templars, or has memory, shaped by centuries, woven them into the fabric of legend? What cannot be denied is that after Bannockburn, Scotland became a peculiar refuge for ideas and symbols long suppressed elsewhere. Masonic traditions claim deep roots here, their rituals echoing Templar vows. Certain Scottish abbeys bear carvings, crosses, compasses, and symbols that some interpret as remnants of Templar influence. Even Rosslyn Chapel, built more than a century later, is said to carry the fingerprints of an older brotherhood. Whether coincidence or continuity, the echoes are hard to ignore. And beyond symbols, consider the political logic. Scotland, in defiance of both England and Rome, was the perfect harbour for fugitives. A land at war, beyond papal control, would welcome skilled warriors and their resources. If even a handful of ships from La Rochelle reached its shores, they would have found not only sanctuary but purpose, aligning their fate with a kingdom fighting for survival. In this light, the Templars' presence at Bannockburn is not fantasy but strategy. The question remains, what did they bring with them? Was it treasure hidden in Scottish soil? Was it relics safeguarded in abbeys? Or was it simply themselves, men bound by vows that outlived their order's destruction? The answer may be all three. Scotland gained independence, the Templars gained a future, and together they planted seeds that would flower in secret traditions, carried forward through lodges and symbols. Even today, in the rolling hills near Bannockburn, the ground seems heavy with memory. Tourists walk the fields where banners once clashed, yet whispers linger. Some claim to see riders in white cloaks when mist rolls thick at dawn, phantoms of an order that refused to die. Others point to the peculiar endurance of Templar imagery in Scottish lore, a persistence stronger here than anywhere else in Europe. Perhaps it is only myth, perhaps it is more. What is certain is that the fleet from La Rochelle did not scatter blindly. Each destination carried meaning. In Scotland, the meaning was survival through alliance, a rebirth forged in battle. And from Bannockburn's shadow, the Templar's story flows south once more, toward another land where their cross would reappear not as exile, but as Vatican, Portugal, where the Order of Christ would rise from the ashes of the temple and launch ships into the age of discovery. If Scotland offered refuge in shadows, Portugal offered rebirth in sunlight. There, along the western edge of Europe, where land gives way to ocean, the memory of the Templars did not vanish, it transformed. When the papal decree dissolved the Order of the Temple in 1312, Portuguese King Denis faced a choice. To obey Rome would mean surrendering lands, fortresses, and men who had been loyal defenders of his realm. To resist would mean challenging the Pope outright. Denis chose a third path, one as cunning as it was daring. He created a new order. In 1319, the papacy approved the establishment of the Order of Christ. On the surface, it was a fresh fraternity, untainted by the accusations of heresy. In truth, it was the Temple reborn. Its first members were largely former Templars, their properties transferred intact, their vows reshaped but not erased. Where in France the knights were dragged to dungeons and pyres, in Portugal they found sanctuary under a new name. The red cross they had once borne on white mantles soon appeared again, painted boldly on sails that would carry Portugal into the unknown. Consider the irony. In France, Philip the Fair had tried to erase the order to claim its wealth. In Portugal, Denis preserved the order and with it gained the seeds of an empire. The Order of Christ became the engine of exploration, financing voyages, training navigators, and blessing ships. When Prince Henry the Navigator established his school at Sagres in the 15th century, he did so as Grand Master of this order. The Red Cross, once flown above Jerusalem, now unfurled across the Atlantic, emblazoned on caravels bound for Africa, India, and Brazil. The continuity is unmistakable. Techniques of fortification, banking, and maritime skill, honed by Templars across centuries, became tools of empire. Maps and charts, perhaps preserved from the East or carried aboard the vanished fleet, informed the daring journeys of Portuguese explorers. When Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope, when Cabral landed on the shores of Brazil, when Magellan's fleet circumnavigated the globe, their sails bore the crimson cross of the Order of Christ. A medieval brotherhood condemned in France had become the symbol of discovery in Portugal. Was this coincidence, or was it deliberate, a carefully guided transformation? If the fleet from La Rochelle carried more than coinage, it carried documents, relics, or knowledge. Portugal may have been its destination. Unlike Scotland, where secrecy cloaked survival, Portugal allowed visibility. Under royal protection, the order thrived openly, its influence woven into the very fabric of national destiny. The treasure of the Templars, whatever its form, was not buried here. It was invested. Picture the docks of Lisbon in the 15th century. Ships rise like towers of wood and canvas. Crews chant as they prepare for voyages beyond the map's edge. And above them, painted bold against white canvas, shines the Red Cross. To the ordinary sailor, it is a blessing, a mark of divine protection. To those who remember, it is something older, a symbol that once marked knights who defied kings, who kept secrets beneath Jerusalem's stones. The same cross that terrified enemies on Crusader fields now greets new horizons. It is continuity disguised as progress. Historians note that the Order of Christ grew fabulously wealthy, not unlike its predecessor. Its estates funded expeditions, its coffers supported monarchs. Yet again, as in the days of the Temple, wealth was not the final aim but the means. The true treasure lay in influence, in knowledge, in the shaping of worlds. By the time Columbus sailed under the Spanish crown, Portugal had already claimed vast oceans through Templar airs, their red cross spreading not by sword but by sail. And here, perhaps, lies a deeper layer of the mystery. What if the fleet from La Rochelle did not scatter randomly, but deliberately? Some ships north to Scotland, others south to Portugal. Survival in one, reinvention in the other. By scattering, the order ensured that if one branch failed, another would endure. The Scottish legends speak of warriors at Bannockburn. The Portuguese chronicles show the Red Cross rising again, this time across seas. Together, they suggest not the death of the temple but its metamorphosis. Still, questions linger. What else was carried into Portugal besides men and estates? were relics hidden in monasteries, relics whose presence lent divine legitimacy to exploration, were charts of unknown lands among the cargoes, helping navigators push farther than their contemporaries believed possible. The tantalizing suggestion arises when we consider how quickly Portugal leapt ahead of rivals, how confidently its sailors moved into waters others feared. Coincidence or inheritance? Standing today before the great monastery in Lisbon, built with the wealth of empire, one sees carvings that echo Templar symbolism, knots, crosses, geometric designs that hint at continuity. Walk the cloisters, and you feel the same blend of austerity and grandeur that marked the order centuries before. The stone seems to whisper, "We never vanished, we only changed our sails." And perhaps that is the final truth of Portugal's role. The Order of Christ was not merely a successor, it was a mask worn long enough that the world forgot the face behind it. By the time explorers carried the Red Cross across the globe, few remembered its origin in La Rochelle's vanished fleet. The Templars had succeeded in the ultimate act of secrecy, survival not by hiding in shadows, but by stepping into the light under another name. The Red Cross on those sails remains one of history's most haunting images. To some, it symbolizes courage and discovery. To others, conquest and colonization. But beneath both lies a deeper resonance, the echo of an order that kings could not kill, an order that learned to transform persecution into power. The fleet may have left La Rochelle in silence, but its voice resounded across oceans, speaking in the language of sails and stars. And yet, even as the Order of Christ flourished, whispers persisted that not all the fleet turned south. Some ships may have carried their burdens westward into seas uncharted centuries before Columbus. For, in the New World, clues would appear: strange carvings, mysterious artifacts, whispers of visitors who should not have been there. If Scotland and Portugal were survival and rebirth, perhaps the Atlantic was something else: expansion into the unknown. High in the valleys of the Alps, where snow-fed rivers carve their way through stone and silence, another thread of the Templar mystery weaves itself. Switzerland, a landlocked country far from the roar of the ocean, seems an unlikely harbor for a vanished fleet. Yet here, among mountains that guard secrets as jealously as vault doors, whispers persist that a fragment of the Templar legacy took root not in castles or battlefields, but in numbers, in ledgers, in the art of secrecy itself. When the order fell in 1307, the knights who escaped needed more than swords and sanctuaries. They needed a way to preserve wealth, to move it unseen, to hide it not in earth but in system. Switzerland, fractured into cantons and remote valleys, offered exactly that. Out of reach of kings, insulated by geography, it was a place where an exiled brotherhood could vanish into the folds of the mountains, shaping the customs of local guilds and councils, sowing traditions that would later blossom into something new. Banking secrecy. Historians note that by the 14th and 15th centuries, Swiss communities were already developing practices of collective defense, tight-knit alliances, and above all, discretion. Documents suggest that early Swiss bankers handled deposits with a degree of confidentiality unusual for the time. Was this a natural evolution, or was it an inheritance from men who had once guarded Europe's wealth across continents? The Templars had invented letters of credit, slips of parchment that allowed a pilgrim to deposit coin in London and withdraw it in Jerusalem. They pioneered financial instruments centuries before their time. And when their castles burned, when their knights were dragged to the stake, the knowledge of those systems did not vanish. Knowledge never does. It migrates. Picture a Templar knight, stripped of armor, his cloak hidden beneath peasant clothes, riding through alpine passes. He carries no chest of gold, only documents, coded records of deposits and debts, names written in symbols only his brothers could read. In the silence of a mountain chapel, he passes this knowledge to guild leaders, men who will adopt the practices without ever revealing the source. Over time, secrecy becomes a custom, then a law, then a national identity. By the time Switzerland emerges as a center of finance in the modern era, the Templar fingerprints are invisible but indelible. Skeptics scoff at this connection, pointing out that centuries separate the fall of the Templars and the rise of Swiss banking. Yet continuity is not always linear. It is often subterranean. A seed buried in soil does not sprout at once, it waits, it adapts, it grows when conditions are right. The Templars were masters of such patience. If a fragment of their fleet carried wealth into the Alps, hidden in monasteries or in vaults beneath towns like Geneva and Zurich, then Switzerland's later dominance in banking may not be coincidence at all, but culmination. There is also the matter of symbols. Certain Swiss cantonal flags bear red crosses on white fields, a striking echo of the Templar banner. Of course, crosses were common in medieval heraldry, but when combined with the tradition of secrecy, the parallels raise eyebrows. The Swiss military ethos, rooted in collective defense rather than conquest, also mirrors Templar vows of fraternity and mutual protection. In both, we find the same paradox: an organization that wields immense power precisely because it hides its true structure in plain sight. Consider the law of banking secrecy itself. In the 20th century, it became infamous, shielding accounts from prying governments, preserving anonymity above all. But the instinct behind it is far older. It reflects a philosophy that information is treasure, that trust must be guarded by silence. This philosophy matches exactly the Templar creed. What if this law, codified in modern times, is only the legal descendant of practices whispered in mountain valleys by men who once carried the world's most sensitive accounts? The deeper we look, the more Switzerland feels less like an anomaly and more like a sanctuary that absorbed the intangible wealth of the temple. Not swords, not relics, but methods. Not gold, but the art of guarding gold. In this sense, the fleet may not have needed to sail into alpine lakes at all. What it carried could travel in the minds of men, in parchment folded into saddlebags, in the habits of fugitives who knew that survival depended not on steel but on secrecy. Imagine the transformation. The Templars, once seen as warriors of the cross, shift into invisible guardians of wealth. Their battlefields become ledgers, their fortresses become vaults, their armor becomes silence. To the world, they are gone. To those who look closer, they live on in institutions that shape nations. Of course, definitive proof remains elusive. No archive in Zurich has produced a document stamped with the Templar seal. No vault has yielded a chest marked with their cross. But perhaps that is the point. True secrecy leaves no artifact, no smoking gun. It leaves only shadows, habits, symbols, and whispers strong enough to endure centuries. Switzerland today stands as the banking heart of the world, a place where secrecy is sacrosanct. Whether coincidence or legacy, the resemblance to the order that first mastered financial invisibility is uncanny. And so, in tracing the fleet, we find another possibility. Some ships may have carried treasure west to Nova Scotia, others south to Portugal. But perhaps another thread wound its way inland, not to sea but to stone, to a landlocked sanctuary that would carry forward not the Templar name but their essence. If so, then the fleet's greatest act was not survival, not even reinvention, but dispersal. Each fragment, becoming a different form. Warriors in Scotland, explorers in Portugal, bankers in Switzerland. The order broken, yet multiplied. Stand today on a Swiss mountainside, watching the fog curl through valleys. Beneath the quiet villages, beneath the glass towers of Zurich, beneath the anonymity of vaults, perhaps the whisper of the Templars still lingers. They did not vanish. They adapted. They transformed treasure into trust, and trust into power. And in doing so, they ensured that no king, no pope, no fire could truly destroy them. Yet even this is not the end. For while Europe holds its fragments, another possibility calls from across the ocean. What if some ships did not stop in Scotland or Portugal or Switzerland at all? What if they sailed west into seas uncharted, leaving behind not only treasure but footprints in a world not yet mapped? For in the new world, whispers of their presence rise from stone carvings, from plants carved in chapels, from legends that should not exist. While Scotland, Portugal, and Switzerland offer clear trails of survival and reinvention, another thread of the Templar mystery lies hidden within the bustling trade routes of Northern Europe. Here, along the Baltic and North Seas, a powerful network rose during the very years when the Templars were being hunted to extinction, the Hanseatic League. Outwardly, it was a confederation of merchants and guilds, cities bound by commerce rather than conquest. Yet to some, the League was more than a trade alliance. It was a mask and elegant disguise beneath which Templar exiles might have continued their work, their symbols and their secrecy. The Hanseatic League emerged in the 13th and 14th centuries, linking ports from Lübeck to Hamburg, Riga to Bergen, London to Novgorod. Its ships crisscrossed northern waters, carrying salt, grain, timber, and cloth. But they carried something else as well: influence. The League grew so powerful that kings and princes often bowed to its demands. It minted its own laws, enforced its own order, even waged wars when its interests were threatened. In an age where monarchs claimed divine right, the Hanseatic League stood as a republic of merchants, independent, disciplined, and secretive. And here the parallels with the Templars begin to shimmer. The knights had once been warriors turned bankers, blending steel with finance. The League was merchants turned rulers, blending trade with sovereignty. Both commanded fleets, both stretched across borders, both operated with a loyalty not to crown or pope, but to their own brotherhood. Both kept records in code, guarded their transactions, and valued secrecy above all. Could it be coincidence that, as the Templar fleet vanished in 1307, the League's power reached its height? Or is there a hidden connection, a silent transfusion of men, methods, and money from one brotherhood into another? Consider the symbols. On coins, seals, and banners of the Hanseatic League appear crosses, compasses, and star-like emblem shapes that echo Templar iconography. Of course, these designs were not unique to the temple, but their recurrence in the very cities where Templar properties once stood suggests continuity. Lübeck, the Queen of the Hanse, rose just as Templar influence waned in France. Hamburg, another hub, shows records of sudden influxes of wealth in the early 14th century, wealth with no clear origin. Imagine it, ships from La Rochelle slipping not only westward or southward, but north, rounding Brittany, entering the Channel, then sailing into the North Sea. They dock quietly in Hanseatic ports, their crews speaking little, their cargoes unlisted. There, among merchants who valued profit over politics, the knights might have found sanctuary. No papal edict could reach into the counting houses of Lübeck. No French king could seize ships under the protection of the League. For a brotherhood trained in secrecy, the League was not just a refugiate, was camouflage. Even the League's structure suggests influence. Decisions were made in councils, votes taken in assemblies. Loyalty was to the collective, not to a sovereign. This mirrored the chapter meetings of the Templars, where knights voted on matters of order and finance. The resemblance may be circumstantial, but it is striking enough to invite speculation. Was the League simply merchants learning discipline, or was it discipline learned from men who had once worn the cross? The deeper we look, the more intriguing details emerge. In the records of English customs officials, there are notes of Hanseatic ships sailing under unknown marks, vessels that appeared, traded, and vanished without proper registry. Some scholars dismissed this as smuggling. But what if it was more? What if these unmarked vessels were fragments of the Templar fleet, sailing under League protection, their identities hidden behind the facade of commerce? Picture a Hanseatic convoy in the Baltic, sleek cogs with high sides and square sails, loaded with salt fish and wool. Among them, one ship carries no ordinary cargo, but documents sealed in wax, relics wrapped in cloth, or men whose names must not be spoken. To the outside world, it is a merchant ship like any other. To those who know, it is a vessel of continuity, carrying forward a legacy under the watchful shield of trade. Of course, we must tread carefully. No parchment exists that declares, the Templars became the Hanseatic League. History rarely gives us such clarity. But what we do have are patterns. Wealth unaccounted for, ships unrecorded, symbols repeated, practices mirrored. In these patterns, we glimpse possibility. And possibility, when repeated across centuries, becomes tradition. The Hanseatic League eventually waned, its power eroded by nation-states rising in strength. But the ethos it carried, the secrecy, the independence, the ability to bend kings through finance and fleet, did not vanish. It flowed into modern systems of trade, banking, and law. And if the Templars did indeed shelter within it, then the League becomes another mask, another face worn by a brotherhood that refused to die. Stand today in Lübeck's old town, its brick spires rising against the northern sky. Walk the alleys where merchants once plotted routes across seas. Look closely at the stone carvings, the coins in museums, the guild symbols etched into wood. The ordinary traveler sees commerce, but the attentive eye might see echoes of something older, something hidden, something carried in silence from La Rochelle's lost fleet. If Scotland was survival and Portugal was rebirth, then the Hanseatic League may have been disguise away for the Templars to vanish into the crowd of merchants, to turn their cross into coin, to become invisible by becoming ordinary. And invisibility, as they had long known, is the most enduring form of power. But the fleet's trail does not end in northern waters. Beyond commerce, beyond Europe's shores, whispers grow of voyages westward, of landfalls made before Columbus, of tunnels dug in strange islands, of chapels carved with plants unknown to medieval Europe. If the League provided disguise, then the Atlantic offered expansion, and in the New World, the Templar legacy may have left its most haunting echoes of all. Across the restless Atlantic, beyond the horizon known to medieval Europe, legends insist the Templars left traces. If Scotland gave them sanctuary, if Portugal gave them rebirth, and if the Hanseatic League gave them disguise, then perhaps the New World gave them something even greater, expansion. Long before Columbus, long before Magellan, whispers claim that white-cloaked men had already crossed the ocean, planting seeds of presence in lands no European was yet meant to know. The most famous of these whispers drifts from Nova Scotia, where Oak Island conceals its pit of traps and tunnels. But the story does not end there. Farther south, on the shores of what is now New England. Local tribes preserved stories of pale strangers arriving in great ships. To some, they were gods. To others, wanderers who came, traded, and vanished. The details shift like sand, but the pattern remains. Visitors whose presence cannot be easily explained. And then there is Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland, built in the 15th century, more than a century after the fall of the temple. Within its stone, carved into arches and bosses, are plants unmistakably native to the Americas: maize and aloe. How could a mason in Scotland carve what no European should have seen until Columbus returned in 1493? Unless, of course, knowledge had crossed the Atlantic earlier, carried not by chance but by intention. Imagine a fragment of the La Rochelle fleet, its sails set west instead of north or south. The ocean stretches vast, unforgiving, but the knights were not amateurs. They had maps, perhaps copied from older sources: Byzantine, Islamic, even relics from lost civilizations. They had the resources to prepare, the secrecy to conceal, and the desperation to risk everything on waters most feared. Days turned to weeks, weeks to months, and then land. Not the fabled Cathay, but a coastline untamed, forests thick, rivers vast, peoples unknown. To the knights, it was exile. To us, it is mystery. Theories abound. Some suggest the Templars reached Newfoundland, their knowledge preserved in the Vinland maps, later attributed to the Norse. Others insist they landed farther south, in the Caribbean, leaving symbols in stone circles and petroglyphs. Still others point to strange artifacts found in North America: coins, swords, carvings that seem centuries out of place. Many are dismissed as hoaxes, curiosities without provenance. Yet their persistence raises the same unsettling question. Why do such objects keep appearing, echoing the same story told in whispers, that someone came before Columbus? Picture Oak Island again, not as a lone anomaly, but as part of a larger pattern. The pit's ingenious flood traps, the tunnels, the imported fibers all speak of advanced engineering, far beyond the needs of fishermen. Could it have been a vault built by Templars who carried more than treasure, perhaps scrolls, maps, or relics too dangerous to leave behind? If so, Oak Island becomes not the resting place of gold, but the reliquary of knowledge, sealed beneath earth and tied until the world is ready. Rosslyn's carvings add another piece. If maize and aloe are indeed depicted there, then someone carried the memory of those plants back across the sea before Columbus. Who else, if not those who had reason to travel in secrecy? The chapel itself is steeped in symbolism: knots, stars, compasses, echoes of Templar iconography. Was it a silent record of their voyages, carved into stone so that the memory could not be erased, even if the fleet itself was forgotten? Skeptics argue, of course. They point to naturalistic designs, to misinterpretations of carvings, to chance resemblance of plants. They remind us that legends are fertile soil for invention, and yet silence cannot explain everything. Too many anomalies, too many echoes across continents, too many whispers lining up with the fleet's disappearance. If nothing had crossed, why do the shadows remain? Think of the Templars' mission. They were guardians not only of relics, but of knowledge. If their survival meant scattering, why not scatter across oceans? By planting seeds in the New World, they ensured that their legacy could not be bound to Europe as kings or Rome as decrees. Survival, rebirth, disguise, expansion, the fourfold strategy of a brotherhood that always thought beyond its time. Today, when you stand among the pines of Nova Scotia, the wind carries more than salt. It carries the weight of unspoken centuries. Beneath your feet may lie tunnels dug by hands that once defended Jerusalem. Carved in stone in distant Scotland are plants that should not exist there. Across North America, scattered artifacts cry out for context. Each whisper on its own may be fragile. Together they weave a chorus. The fleet did not vanish. It scattered, and in scattering, it touched shores not yet named. What if Columbus did not discover, but rediscover? What if the maps he carried, the confidence with which he sailed west, were drawn from knowledge already in circulation, preserved in secret circles that traced their lineage to La Rochelle? In this light, the Templars become not relics of crusade, but precursors of globalization, navigators of a world not yet aware of itself. And yet, the most haunting possibility is that they left something behind. Not treasure, not gold, but influence symbols seeded into cultures. Stories whispered into myth, alliances forged and forgotten. If the fleet truly reached the New World, then its impact may linger not only in artifacts, but in the DNA of history itself. Perhaps this is why the mystery refuses to die. It is not about what they carried, but where they carried it, and how it changed the world long before the world was ready to admit it. As the sun sets on Oak Island, casting long shadows over the restless sea, one cannot help but wonder. The pit remains flooded, the carvings remain unproven, the artifacts remain contested, but the silence, as always, is telling. Silence does not endure for nothing. Silence guards, and the silence of the Atlantic whispers still of ships that sailed west in the dark, carrying seeds of a legacy that sprouted on unfamiliar soil. The trail now leads us to one of the most enduring explanations of the fleet's survival. The idea that it did not move as one body, but deliberately scattered fragments sent north, south, inland, and west, each carrying a part of the whole. A strategy of dispersion that turned destruction into immortality. To understand this, we must turn to what some call the scattering theory that unites all the whispers into a single design. Through every whisper, every anomaly, every silence in the record, a single possibility begins to emerge. The Templar fleet of La Rochelle did not vanish into one destiny, but many. The ships did not sail in one column, bound for one haven, but scattered like sparks carried on the wind. Some north, some south, some inland, some west. This, the scattering theory suggests, was no accident. It was design, a design born from desperation, but executed with precision, the ultimate survival strategy of a brotherhood that had mastered secrecy as an art. Think of the night of October 13th, 1307, when arrests spread across France like fire through dry straw. The Templars had warning. Rumors whisper that riders galloped through the countryside in the days before, bearing coded signals. At La Rochelle, ships were readied not for trade, but for flight. Imagine the fleet assembled in the harbor, lanterns dimmed, sails furled, crews silent. And then, at a signal known only to captains and commanders, they slip into the black water, one by one, vanishing into the Atlantic fog. But they do not sail together. To move as one would be to risk annihilation. If caught, all would be lost treasure, relics, knowledge, men. Instead, they divide. Some ships head north towards Scotland, where Robert the Bruce waits in defiance of both England and Rome. Others steer south toward Portugal, where King Denis offers sanctuary under a new name, the Order of Christ. Others hug the coastlines of the Low Countries, blending into merchant convoys of the Hanseatic League. And perhaps a few, driven by boldness or desperation, steer west into the unknown, their prows cutting toward a horizon not yet charted. In this scattering, the Templars transformed weakness into resilience. They turned destruction into multiplication. Each fragment became a seed planted in different soil, ensuring that even if one perished, others would endure. This is why their legacy surfaces in so many places, in so many forms. Knights at Bannockburn, red crosses on Portuguese sails, banking secrecy in Swiss valleys, merchant dominance in Hanseatic ports, carvings of American maize in Rosslyn chapel lore. Of these fragments may not be contradictions, but confirmations. Each is a ripple of the same event, the scattering of the fleet. Consider the logic. The Templars were not amateurs. They had guarded Europe's wealth for 2 centuries. They had mapped routes across the Mediterranean, charted rivers in the Holy Land, built castles with hidden chambers and escape tunnels. To plan a scattering fleet was well within their ability. Indeed, it may have been their final masterpiece. An exodus hidden by silence, a dispersion disguised as disappearance. And what of the cargo? Here the whispers grow louder. Some say gold, melted down and carried in chests. Others insist it was relic species of the true cross, chalices, even fragments of the Ark of the Covenant smuggled from Jerusalem centuries earlier. Still others believe it was knowledge, scrolls, gospels, forbidden texts, maps of lands long forgotten. Whatever it was too precious to trust to one voyage. Only by dividing it, by scattering it, could it be preserved. Imagine a ship bound for Scotland carrying knights, battle-hardened and armed, ready to fight again. Another sails for Portugal, its hold heavy with maps and charts, soon to fuel the age of discovery. Another heads inland, bearing financial ledgers, the seeds of systems that would flourish in Switzerland. And another points its prow westward, its cargo a mystery, perhaps a relic, perhaps only the dream of a new world. Each ship becomes a chapter in a story too vast to write in one volume. This theory also explains why traces appear across centuries, disconnected yet strangely consistent. Why do Scottish legends speak of mysterious knights? Why do Portuguese caravels fly the Templar cross? Why does Swiss secrecy echo the temple's banking methods? Why do American carvings depict plants no European should have seen? Each anomaly alone can be dismissed. Together, they form a pattern too deliberate to ignore. The fleet did not vanish, it scattered. Skeptics scoff, arguing that such coordination would have been impossible in the chaos of arrest. But chaos is precisely what the Templars trained for. Their vows demanded discipline, their structures ensured loyalty, their codes secured communication. If any brotherhood of the Middle Ages could have orchestrated such a maneuver under pressure, it was the Temple, and the very silence that surrounds the fleet's fate suggests success. For if they had failed, records of their capture would exist. Instead, there is only absence. An absence, as we have seen, is its own kind of presence. Picture it now. The knights see off La Rochelle, lanterns extinguished, sails billowing in a cold Atlantic wind. A dozen ships part company, each vanishing into a different darkness. North, south, inland, west. The crews do not know if they will see each other again, but they know this. By scattering, they carry hope. By scattering, they deny Philip his prize. By scattering, they ensure that even if history erases them, the world will never be free of their shadow. Centuries later, that shadow lingers. In battlefields, in chapels, in vaults, in symbols carved in stone, in flags that still fly. The scattering theory does not prove the fleet's fate, but it explains the whispers. It unites the fragments. It turns contradictions into design, chaos into strategy, mystery into survival. And if the theory is true, then the Templars succeeded in their greatest mission. They did not preserve their order in one fortress, one fleet, one land. They preserved it everywhere, hidden in plain sight, scattered across continents, surviving not as one, but as many. The fleet of La Rochelle may never be found whole, but perhaps it was never meant to be. Perhaps its power lies precisely in its scattering, in the impossibility of pinning it down, in the way its fragments echo across history, defying kings, defying popes, defying even time itself. And so, we are left with a haunting thought. If the fleet scattered by design, then its legacy is not only behind us, it may still be among us. In symbols we overlook, in systems we obey, in traditions we inherit without knowing. The Templars may be gone, or perhaps, in scattering, they became eternal. From this realization, the story now turns toward its deepest mystery, the nature of the legacy itself. Was the fleet's purpose merely survival, or was it transformation, a metamorphosis into something the world still cannot fully see? To answer that, we must peer into the symbols that linger: the Grail, the cross, the compass, and ask what message the Templars left for those willing to follow the scattered trail to its end. Of all the whispers that cling to the vanished Templar fleet, none is more haunting than the Grail. Not the golden hoards kings imagined, not the ledgers of wealth that bankers feared, but the vessel of myth, the chalice of Christ, the cup of Last Supper, or perhaps something stranger, something far older. The Grail has worn many masks through the centuries, a relic of wood or stone, a bloodline carried in flesh, a secret of knowledge so vast it could remake the world. And when we follow the trail of the scattered fleet, the question arises again and again. Was this the true treasure they carried, the hidden legacy that no king, no pope, no empire was ever meant to claim? The legends connect like threads in a tapestry. At Rosslyn Chapel, stone carvings echo Grail imagery, their geometric knots suggesting secrets encoded in architecture. In Portugal, the Order of Christ preserved rituals that some say mirrored Grail guardianship initiation rites whispered in candlelit halls, symbols painted in red that hinted at more than exploration. In Switzerland, secrecy itself became the relic, a Grail of silence guarding treasure not of gold but of knowledge. And in Scotland, where Bannockburn turned the tide of history, some whispered that Bruce's victory was sanctified not just by knights in exile, but by something they carried with them, something holy, something untouchable. What if the Grail was never meant to be one object, but an idea scattered, like the fleet itself, into many forms? A chalice in one land, a bloodline in another, a manuscript hidden in vaults, a code carved in stone, each fragment preserving not the whole, but a reflection, a shard of light refracted into the world. In this way, the Grail becomes not just a relic, but a strategy. The Templars did not guard it in one vault, they scattered it everywhere, ensuring that no hand could ever close around it entirely. Consider the symbolism. The Grail is always a vessel, a container, but what it contains is always ambiguous wine, blood, light, truth. Perhaps this ambiguity is deliberate. To the faithful, it is divine presence. To kings, it is legitimacy. To scholars, it is forbidden knowledge. To the Templars, it may have been all of these at once, a secret that had to be divided, disguised, and carried across oceans to preserve it from both greed and destruction. Imagine a Templar ship at La Rochelle, its hold not heavy with gold, but with scrolls wrapped in linen, chests of manuscripts written in a language no outsider could read. Imagine another vessel carrying not objects, but people, families, sworn to silence, guardians of a bloodline whose survival mattered more than treasure. Imagine another that bore only symbols, banners, and rituals, the tools of a mystery religion that could be planted in distant soil and take root as lodges, orders, and brotherhoods. Each ship a grail of its own, carrying a fragment of the hidden legacy. Skeptics, of course, dismiss this as myth layered upon myth. They argue that the Grail is a literary invention born from medieval romances, given life by poets like de Troyes, who spun tales of knights and quests. But is it coincidence that these tales surged precisely as the Templars rose in power? Is it chance that the Grail legend and the Templar story became entwined so tightly that one cannot be told without the other? Myths do not grow in a vacuum. They root themselves in history, feeding on truths too dangerous to name directly. And so, the Grail endures, not because it is fantasy, but because it is possibility, a possibility too powerful to be forgotten. The Vatican's silence, the missing letters, the scattered anomalies serve the same function: to conceal. And what is concealment but guardianship? To hide something is to admit its worth. If the Grail was only fiction, why erase so carefully? Why bury so deliberately? The hidden legacy, then, may not be the Grail alone, but the principle it represents. Knowledge that transforms, power that transcends, survival that defies destruction. The Templars may have carried relics, yes, but their greatest legacy was adaptability. They became warriors, bankers, explorers, merchants, guardians of silence. Each incarnation a vessel, each vessel a grail, each grail a continuation of their mission. Picture Rosslyn Chapel again, its vaults heavy with symbolism. Tourists see beauty, initiates see code. The maze and aloe carvings may whisper of voyages to America. The geometric knots may encode sacred numbers. The altar may echo ancient rituals of light and shadow. It is a grail in stone, a container of meaning designed to outlive time. And Rosslyn is only one example. Across Europe, across oceans, the scattered fleet may have built such containers again and again, hiding not relics, but resonance. And what of the bloodline theory, the idea that the Grail was flesh, not cup, the descendants of Christ and Magdalene, protected by knights sworn to secrecy? Whether one accepts this or not, the fleet's scattering fits the pattern. What safer way to preserve a lineage than to divide it, to carry it into different lands, into families whose names no chronicle records? If so, then the Grail walks among us still, not as object, but as blood, anonymous yet eternal. Ultimately, the Grail and the hidden legacy converge into the same haunting truth. The fleet was not running away, it was carrying forward. It was not hiding in fear, but planting in hope. Its mission was not to bury treasure, but to preserve a future, to ensure that when kings burned knights and popes signed decrees, something greater survived. That something, whether relic, blood, knowledge, or all combined, is what we call the Grail. Stand today on the shores of La Rochelle, where the tide laps quietly against stone. Close your eyes, and you can almost hear it. The creak of timbers, the snap of canvas, the whispered vows of men who knew they carried more than their lives in those holds. They carried a secret. They carried a vessel. They carried a legacy meant not for their time, but for ours. And so, the Grail is not gone. It is scattered, hidden in plain sight, waiting for those willing to see. Its legacy endures in symbols, in institutions, in myths that refuse to die. The question is not whether it exists, but whether we have the courage to recognize it when it stands before us. The fleet story now approaches its final convergence. For if the Grail is the hidden legacy, then what becomes of it in our time? Have we already inherited it unknowingly, woven into our flags, our currencies, our laws? Or is its revelation still ahead, waiting for a moment when the scattered fragments align once more? To answer this, we must step into the last chapter, the final convergence, where all the threads, all the whispers, all the scattered sparks may yet ignite into flame. The story of the vanished fleet does not end in scattered whispers, ends in convergence. For centuries, fragments have floated like driftwood across time, letters in dusty archives, crosses on Portuguese sails, symbols in Scottish chapels, secrecy in Swiss vaults, artifacts buried beneath North American soil. Each fragment on its own seems too fragile to bear the weight of truth. But when drawn together, they form a pattern, a constellation across history, pointing back to one night in 1307 when ships slipped from La Rochelle and disappeared into silence. This is the final convergence, the moment when myths, anomalies, and silences no longer appear as isolated accidents, but as echoes of a deliberate design. The scattering theory reminds us that the fleet did not vanish as one, but as many. Scotland, Portugal, Switzerland, the Hanseatic ports, and the New World each became a harbour, each carrying a piece of the Order's treasure, whether relic, knowledge, or living legacy. Like shards of a broken chalice, they were divided, but together they preserved the shape of what was once whole. Look closely at the ripples. In Scotland, the Templars fought at Bannockburn, turning the tide of independence. In Portugal, their Red Cross sailed into the age of discovery, reshaping maps and empires. In Switzerland, their financial genius morphed into banking secrecy that still shapes the world economy. In the Hanseatic League, their methods of discipline and commerce blended into a maritime network that rivaled kings. And across the Atlantic, their symbols and possible artifacts whisper of voyages centuries before Columbus. Different threads, yet woven into the same tapestry. And what of the Grail? Whether chalice, bloodline, or knowledge, it too appears scattered. In Roslyn's carvings, in secret rites of the Order of Christ, in vaults where documents lie buried, in symbols etched into Masonic temples. The Grail endures, not as one relic, but as an idea carried forward by dispersal. This too is convergence. The realization that the fleet's greatest treasure was never meant to rest in one chest or one vault, but to survive through multiplicity. The Vatican's silence becomes more than omission. It becomes confirmation. For why erase so much? Why mislabel so carefully? Why bury so deeply, unless what was hidden was too dangerous to allow into light? Absence itself becomes testimony. And when modern algorithms parse these silences, finding patterns across centuries, the past begins to speak again. In this digital age, the fleet re-emerges, not as ships on the horizon, but as data points aligning into a map. Picture the final scene, not La Rochelle's harbour, but the entire world as the fleet's ocean. Ships slipping into different directions, scattering across seas, planting seeds in distant lands. Centuries pass, kingdoms rise and fall, but the seeds endure. And now, as we connect them, the outline of the fleet reappears, not as wood and sail, but as legacy woven through systems, symbols, and myths that still shape our present. Consider this: the Red Cross of the Templars still flies today, not as a battle banner, but as the emblem of humanitarian aid, the sign of the Red Cross. Banking systems still rely on the methods first mastered by the Knights. Exploration, globalization, secrecy, even the very idea of hidden brotherhoods all carry the fingerprints of the temple. If so much endures, then perhaps the fleet never sank at all. Perhaps it sails still, hidden not in waters, but in the structures of our world. The final convergence is not simply historical, it is existential. It forces us to ask, what if the Templars succeeded? What if their scattering was not survival alone, but transformation? What if their order did not die, but metamorphosed into forms we still live within? If so, then their legacy is not a curiosity of the past, but a presence in our present. The banking secrecy of Switzerland, the exploration of Portugal, the legends of Scotland, the global networks of Commerçor may be modern sails of an ancient fleet. And perhaps this is why the mystery endures. For if the fleet is found, it will not be as rotting timbers on the ocean floor. It will be in our institutions, our flags, our stories, our very way of seeing the world. The Templars may not ride in white cloaks anymore, but their shadows fall across boardrooms, lodges, parliaments, and cathedrals. The final convergence shows us not what they hid, but how profoundly they shaped what we are. Stand once more on the shores of La Rochelle. The tide rolls in, gulls wheel overhead, and the stones remember. Close your eyes, and you see lanterns vanish into fog, sails turning toward different horizons. You hear the creak of ropes, the murmur of vows, the silence that swallowed them, and you realize they are still out there. Not as ships, but as whispers, as legacies scattered across the globe. The final convergence is not discovery, it is recognition. Recognition that some mysteries refuse to be solved because they are not puzzles, but mirrors. To chase the Templar fleet is to chase the story of how power survives, how secrets endure, how silence shapes history. And in that chase, we glimpse something unsettling. The Templars did not fail. They succeeded so completely that their legacy is invisible because it has become part of the world itself. So perhaps the fleet's greatest treasure was not gold, relics, or even the Grail. Perhaps it was the lesson they left us, that what scatters does not die, that silence can be louder than words, and that a brotherhood built on secrecy can outlast fire, sword, and time. The fleet is gone, but its wake still ripples through centuries. And if we listen carefully, in archives, in symbols, in whispers of wind over water, we may still hear it, the echo of sails in the dark, carrying a secret that was never lost, only hidden.